So please welcome esteemed speaker, hero of humanism, C Grayling.
If I were to talk like this, would I be audible? Could you?
Yeah, you would.
It would be okay, because I might break into song otherwise. Thank you. I must begin with an apology, which is that I have an early commitment in London tomorrow morning, so at 5 minutes to the next hour, I have to flee in order to get the train back, and I'm very apologetic about that. You will have noticed that London has very inconveniently placed itself at a distance from Exeter, so that's the main reason for it. So my theme is Theism, Atheism and Proof. That's the title of the lecture, because I'd like to discuss really one of the cruces, and there are many, between people who have a religious outlook, who are committed to the metaphysics of theism, and those who don't share that kind of view. But I'll just begin by clarifying a few terms here so that we know just which bit of the great argument that is now going on between these two rather amorphous camps we're talking about. The three ismic labels, that is atheism and secularism and humanism, are separable from one another, although there's obviously a very natural connection between them. The debate between theists and atheists is, as I said, a metaphysical debate, because it's about what there is, what kind of place the universe is, and what exists in it or in association with it in some way. So theists think that there are divine agencies or entities, or transcendent agencies or entities, either in or outside or associated with the universe in some way. And an atheist is somebody who simply doesn't think in those terms and thinks rather differently about the metaphysics of the universe. Now, the word atheist is, of course, a theist's word to describe somebody who doesn't take their point of view in this matter. And we now all live with that word, and we perhaps even in some cases proudly. But there are better words, really. I would much rather call myself a naturalist, if that didn't suggest to people that I take my clothes off and run around the woods again. Or a free thinker, or just nothing at all, because why have a label in this particular branch if it's a question of what you don't think is the case, rather than some positive view where you want to identify the fact that you have a commitment. Of course, it's now very well known that the relationship between a theistic outlook and an atheistic outlook is exactly the same as the relationship between doing something, having a hobby, as it might be. And the trope now is stamp collecting, so the theist is like the stamp collector, and the atheist is like a person who doesn't collect stamps. And as you can see, it's a very different kind of position to occupy. And this is why, when people talk about militant atheists, they're making a mistake. There can be militant secularists, that's true, people who would really like to push religious observance and practice back into the private sphere, or to get rid of it altogether. But it's very hard to be a militant non-stamp collector. You can try not collecting stamps militantly and see if it works. And so that's just a misnomer. So the theism-atheism debate, a metaphysical debate, and that's what I'm going to be concentrating on this evening. But we should bear in mind that the secularism debate, which is about the place of religious organizations and the religious voice in the public square and its influence on public policy matters, is perhaps actually the really crucial thing at the moment in our world, where the pressure, I suppose, on traditional outlooks in our world is felt to be harmful, threatening, dangerous, upsetting to people who have those outlooks, and therefore some of them are fighting back and doing it in violent ways sometimes. And therefore the question about how we manage the relationship between religious commitment in our various societies and those societies is a pressing issue. And this is the issue of secularism. And of course there are some religious secularists, that is, people who have a religious commitment but who themselves feel that religion shouldn't be at the top table in public policy matters or having an influence on government. I mean, after all, secularism began as a movement in the church because they wanted to keep the temporal powers out of church business. They didn't want the church to be kept out of the business of temporal powers, of course, and they've always been there, but they did want a separation of church and state in order to protect their own interests. So secularism doesn't have to be exclusively the province or the interest of people who don't, who are not theists, but nevertheless, it's very natural for people who are atheists also to be secularists. And then the final ism is humanism, and humanism is actually my main interest in this great debate, because humanism is an attitude to how we live our lives and how we make choices about what kind of people we are and how we're to relate to one another. In other words, it's an ethical outlook. And it very often happens that people who have a religious commitment say, well, if you don't have a religious commitment, what is the basis for your thinking about morality and society and how we're to live together? And when they say that, of course, they are giving evidence of ignorance of the fact that humanistic, with a small h, outlooks on ethical matters are far more ancient and far richer and more various than the young religions of the world, Christianity and Islam. Young religions because they've only existed really for around about 1500 years, which is, I say, because the Christian religion became dominant in parts of Europe and the Middle East in about the 4th century of the Common Era, and Islam a couple of centuries later. But for nearly 1,000 years before that happened, there had been this wonderfully rich, deep examination of ethical questions in the period of classical antiquity with Plato and Aristotle and their successors in the Stoic and Epicurean and Cynic schools, in the Hellenic period and in the Roman period. And indeed, that kind of thinking about those essentially Socratic questions, how should we think of life and how should we think of ourselves as we live it, are questions that are much deeper and promoted much richer thought than the religious traditions themselves have. And the roots of humanism lie in that very, very fertile soil. And it's something that if we do have time for questions and you'd like me to revert to, I'm very happy to do it. But I do think that humanism offers us an opportunity to have a global ethical outlook that anybody and everybody could sign up to, no matter what part of the world they live in or come from or what ethnicity or cultural background they have. And I was just saying to some of the committee members of the AHS Society here that actually one of the great triumphs of humanism in the last century has been the adoption by countries all around, or many countries around the world anyway, of regimes of human rights. So for example, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, drawn up by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt in the late 1940s, has only one reference to religion, and that is in the article, I think it's Article 18, where freedom of conscience is mooted as a right, and that is the freedom to have and not to have a religion. Of course, the freedom not to have a religion is a freedom that we should be working very hard for now among the many millions of people in religion-dominated countries where it is a positive danger not to have a religion. So the humanism issue is an important one, and I just say this one thing about it, that unlike most moralities, unlike most religious outlooks on questions of ethics, humanism is not a set of prescriptions of do's and don'ts or advice how to live. It just makes two starting demands. And the one demand is that we should approach the question of how we live our lives and how we relate to other people in the most generous and sympathetic way that we can, with the most generous and sympathetic understanding of human nature and the human condition. And of course, the human condition is something that we address and study and examine and debate in our researches into history and philosophy and literature and the social sciences. Human nature is an even more intractable thing to look into because we spend lifetimes failing to understand ourselves, let alone other people, but the endeavor to do it is a central feature of the good and well-lived life. But to be generous and sympathetic means accepting the enormous diversity that there is in human nature and human experience, and trying to accommodate it insofar, at any rate, as it doesn't do serious harm to other people. So that demand is that we try to be as generous in our view about others, accepting that they may have desires and goals that we don't share, but allowing them the space around themselves to do that just as we want the space for ourselves. This is a very important starting point. And the second demand, of course, is that we should think for ourselves and take the responsibility for the choices we make. And that very simple seeming, well, the cliche seeming remark is actually a very pregnant one, because it is itself premised on the idea that we are ultimately responsible for what happens to us in our lives and in the effect that our lives have on other lives, which is quite unlike the standard view in religion, which is that we're not competent to do that. And after all, if you think about some of the central ideas in Christian ethics, well, the great sin in Christianity is the sin of pride, of thinking that you can stand on your own feet and make decisions for yourself. You're born ill, you're born weak, you need salvation, you need the support of the deity. Islam, the very word, means submission, of yielding your responsibility and your choice. The great demand there is to believe and to obey in these religions. And the humanist says, no, be skeptical and think for yourself. And that's the other great demand. And you will all remember, because it's a very standard joke in these discussions now, what Bertrand Russell had to say on the matter, that most people would rather die than think, and most people do, and that's the tragedy of our world. So that's just a few remarks about humanism, and it's of course a theme for a much more expansive discussion. But to come back to my main theme for the evening, which is about the metaphysical contest between theists and atheists. We could begin by examining a remark that theists typically make when you're having a discussion with them in the coffee bar, and that is they say, you can't prove that there isn't a God. And of course this is meant to imply that it's okay to think that there is one, but there's a huge logical gap between the claim, the allegation that you can't prove that there isn't a God, and the thought that there nevertheless might be one. I should just remark at this point, though, that you should have short-circuited the debate already by inviting your interlocutor not to use the word God, but to replace it with something else which illustrates really what's at stake. One good move is to say, don't use the word God, just for the purposes of this conversation, just use the name Fred. And they say, who created the universe? Fred did. And suddenly you see the vacuity of the claim that some agency, ill-defined agency, is being appealed to as the originator of all things. You say, why should we obey the moral law? Because Fred says so. Immediately raises the question, who is Fred? And what right has Fred to legislate on these rather important matters? And again, it illustrates the vacuity of the point. Or better still, make sure that you get your interlocutor not to use the supposed name God, but the phrase gods and goddesses. So do you believe in the existence of gods and goddesses? But the reason for doing that is that you could say to somebody who wanted to debate with you the questions about the existence of deity in the universe, you could say to them, well look, let's first have a discussion about the existence of fairies. That's not a trivial or sort of facile move. You have to remember that up until about a century ago, belief in fairies was very, very widespread in this society in England. They curdled the milk, they stole your shoelaces, they pinched you when you were asleep. In fact, there was quite a lively belief in fairies. There was a great deal of folklore about fairies, and a lot of the stories and illustrations that we have come from that background of folklore. And with a certain touch of irony, one of the reasons why the Church of England established primary schools in the 19th century was to combat superstition about fairies, not about anything else. But if you had a discussion with somebody as to why they don't think that there are fairies at the bottom of their garden, you could say to them, once they've given you their cogent reasons for that conclusion, you could say to them, just export that idea to gods and goddesses or to the deity, because the arguments are naturally exactly the same. So those remarks might short-circuit the need for a discussion, might I say, but not in all probability will, and therefore you would need to move on to this more examined way of approaching the matter. So we take this claim that you can't prove that there isn't a God, or that there aren't gods. And the answer is, of course, you can. and I'm just about to do it for you. Whether that delights you or not. But first you have to understand the nature of proof. Now in a formal system, deductive system, deductive logic for example, or mathematics, a proof occurs when a conclusion of an argument follows with necessity from the premises. And you're all very familiar with this because you were all working through the medieval syllogistic in the bath last night, so you will remember that in the case of a deduction, the reason why the proof follows coercively from the premises, providing that the form of the argument is valid and that you have true premises, is that the conclusion of a deductive proof is always implicit in the premises already. All deductive inferences are circular. Now, they may have no logical novelty, therefore, the conclusions of deductions, but they quite frequently have psychological novelty. This is illustrated by the well-known story of the Duke and the Cardinal. Duke, you see, because he was French. So the Duke was having a weekend party at his chateau on the Loire, and the guest of honor was a cardinal. And at a certain point in the evening, the Duke had to nip down to the cellars to get a few more bottles of Chateauneuf du Pape. And while he was gone, the cardinal regaled the assembled company with a story about how, when he was first ordained, the very first person to whom he gave confession was a vile, multiple murderer. The Duke returns, clutching his bottles of Chateauneuf du Pape. He claps the cardinal on the shoulder and says to the assembled company, "I've known the cardinal for donkey's years, you know. In fact, I was the first person." Whereupon all the guests leave. Now you can see that the inference that the guests drew, that he was a vile, multiple murderer, was already implicit in the premises, but they didn't know it, and so there was psychological novelty in the conclusion, even though there was no logical novelty. And this is characteristic of deductions in formal systems. So proof, and usually when we think in terms of proof, we're thinking of proof in the deductive sense. But in the empirical sense, in the contingent sense, in the real world sense, proof has a different meaning, an important meaning, but an importantly different meaning. It means test. Now if you go to a steel foundry, you will see that, supposing that the foundry is producing steel rods, let us say, that every 100 or so rods, one will be taken and it will be loaded with a weighting to prove it, to test it, to see how much loading it will accept before it fractures. This is known as proving the steel, testing the steel. And this is the key notion of proof in the case of claims about how things stand or what exists in the universe. And the very, very best illustration of this is given by none other than the great Carl Sagan. And some of you would have read this, the example of the dragon in the garage. You know this? You know this story. It goes like this, for those of you who don't know it. Somebody says to you, "I've got a dragon in my garage." You say, "Oh, great, I'd love to see a dragon." And he says, "Ah, well, this one's invisible." So you say, "Oh, damn, well, perhaps we can hear it flying around." Nope, this one flies silently. "Well, can we put talcum powder on the floor and see its footprints?" "Nah, this one never lands on the floor." "Well, can we feel its hot breath?" "Nah, this one doesn't have hot breath," etc. So every effort that you've made to test or prove the claim that there's a dragon in the garage fails. And the things that you say about this dragon in the garage, you can't see it or hear it, feel it, or there's no way of detecting its presence, means that the dragon in the garage, the putative dragon, is equivalent to nothing. So what you've tried to do is you've tried to run a way of testing the claim, or to use the steel foundry analogy, of proving the claims, putting it to the proof. And it's this meaning of the word proof, by the way, that we use in that old saying, it's the exception that proves the rule. The exception tests the rule, tests how far the rule applies. Most people think that if there is an exception to the rule, then that makes the rule okay, so you can do the exception. That's convenient, but it's not what it means. It means it tests the rule. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. That is, the test of the pudding is in the eating. When you've eaten the pudding, you know whether it has worked as a piece of culinary art. So that sense of proof, which is the key sense of proof when we're talking about our metaphysical commitments about the universe. And it illustrates something which is of the very, very first importance. And that is that in the contingent case, in the case of our empirical inquiries about the world, given that what proof constitutes is the testing of claims or theories or hypotheses about the world, that what is not at stake in our thinking about the world is knowledge. Rather, what is at stake is the rationality of our beliefs. To explain this, we notice this, that you can have knowledge of the conclusions of formal deductions. You can legitimately, I think, claim to have knowledge of things that are happening in your local temporal and spatial environment, for example, what's happening now. And I say this partly the skeptics who will think that you've got a problem if you think that you are sitting in a lecture room in Exeter University listening to a lecture, because of course you might be asleep and dreaming or having a nightmare that you're doing that, or you might be deluded that this is happening. I might be a hologram cunningly devised by the AHS Society, or in fact, you know, you might have overdone the illegal substances yesterday, or whatever the reason might be. But the skeptic might have an argument to put to you to say that unless you can rule out 100% all these possibilities, even these very outre possibilities, you cannot claim to know that you were sitting in a lecture theatre at Exeter University hearing a talk. Then you might say, and perhaps the good response would be to say, well, in that case, I don't care about knowledge. But I have an extremely powerful, well-grounded, rational belief that I'm doing this at the moment, because all the evidence and all the tests that I could run on that evidence provide me with an overwhelmingly rational reason for thinking that this is how things are. And so therefore the burden, the epistemic burden, is not on claims to what you know and don't know with 100% certainty, but whether or not it is rational to think that things are a certain way. So I'll give you another example, an example that is appropriate to the current weather conditions. Every time I've been in the rain without an umbrella in the past, I've got wet. But I've also had the great good fortune to read David Hume on the question of induction. So I know that no matter how many instances of something occurred in the past, that's no guarantee that they will occur in the future. You know, the example he uses, on a slightly unfortunate example, is that however many times the sun has risen every morning in the past doesn't follow that it's going to rise tomorrow morning. And in fact, you can adduce the more interesting example that Russell uses about the chicken who was fed every day and protected from the fox and kept thinking life was getting better and better until, of course, he ended up with Sunday lunch. And there's an example of how inductive inferences can go badly wrong. So I think to myself, well, every time I've been in the rain in the past, I've got wet if I haven't had an umbrella, but I've read Hume, so I know that my inductive inference to the future is at least risky. So the next time it rains, I'm not going to take an umbrella because I might not get wet. Now, supposing I thought in that way, what would my neighbours, friends and family think? They would think that that is irrational. Think of the word rationality. Think of the word ratio. It means proportion. It means proportioning the evidence you have for something, for a conclusion or a claim, to the conclusion or the action that you base on that evidence, proportioning it to the evidence in question. To be rational, to hold a belief rationally, is to hold that belief on the basis of the best evidence that you have for it. And so if you think about the way we think about the world, both in our folk physics and psychology, thinking of other people, but also in our more exact inquiries into the nature of the physical universe, into our societies, into our psychologies, we find that the evidence that we accumulate and on which we act, and which enables us to fly aeroplanes and have computers and so on, overwhelmingly gives us the impression that what it is rational to believe is that our world is a realm of natural law, that it is the world that appears to us in our sort of Monday morning sober waking moments when we are thinking reasonably clearly and neutrally about how things are. And when we look at the reasons why people might think that the world is different, that it might have in it supernatural or transcendent agencies of some kind, that their reasons are not of the kind that you would rationally or proportionally base your actions or behavior on. A very simple and crude example, but a bit too knocked down maybe, is this, that you could run the following test. Try to light and heat your house on the basis of attaching it to the local electricity supply, or conversely, try to heat it and light it by prayer, and see which one works. Now that would be a very crude way of running that kind of test. But a better way, if we're examining the rationality of belief, is to look at the reasons why people hold religious beliefs. So this would be the second leg on which an argument runs about proving or testing religious claims. And here, of course, one has to beat round the neighbouring bushes, as David Hume himself might say, since we've mentioned him already, to look at the origins of religion and the psychological motivations that people have for believing that it is rational to hold these beliefs, even though from the other perspective they seem to be at very best non-rational, that the reasons that people have for holding them are emotional reasons or traditional reasons, or because of community pressure, or because many people don't really know whether they believe it or not, but they are forced to be orthopractic because of the societies in which they're brought up. But we could construct a kind of genealogy of thinking about why it's rational to be religious or to have religious beliefs in the following way. On our best evidence about the very early history of the origin of religious attitudes to the world, that is, looking at sort of doing an archaeology of the mythologies of the world, and looking also at those societies in our world today which either have or have traces of these very, very early kinds of beliefs, sort of animistic beliefs. We construct a picture that is roughly like this. That our very earliest ancestors, in an attempt to make sense of natural phenomena of the world around them, made use of the one thing that they were very familiar with and which had some explanatory power, or seemed to have explanatory power. And that is their own experience as agents, as being able to do something or to make a difference or to initiate a causal chain of events. The classicists among you will recognize the etymology of the term agent, ego agere acti actum, to do, to make, to bring about, to be the causal origin of something, to be an actor. And so you could pick up a stone and throw the stone into the pond and make a splash in the pond, and that is something that you've made happen. You therefore think that when the wind blows, or the thunder sounds, or the lightning flares, or the crops grow, or the trees sway in the wind, that these are the results of agency. That there are agents, more powerful, invisible, undetectable by us, but at any rate that agencies are at work in the world and are causally responsible for what happens in the world. So that's a projection from our own felt capacity as agents, as an explanatory tool. And it's a very natural one for them, for our earliest ancestors to have come up with in their attempt to make sense of the world. So a kind of proto-science. And then there would have been a kind of proto-technology, which would have been an attempt to influence these agencies, to communicate with them, or propitiate them, or to encourage them to bring the rain, or to stop the rain, or to make the crops grow. So you can see how that might be a very natural thing for them to do also. In fact, you can easily see that if you, by mistake, ate a magic mushroom, or consumed something which was fermented while you weren't looking and made you drunk, or you had an epileptic fit, or you had a nightmare, that this gave you reason to think that you'd actually been in contact with these agencies, that you'd broken through the barrier, the membrane that separated your world from their world, and that you were in the presence of these agencies. Because my own personal view is that some bloke, and it was a bloke, thought to himself one day, if I tell my fellow tribesmen and women that I can communicate with these agencies and influence their behavior, then I'm going to get all the money and the girls. That's probably some utilitarian view about how efficacious it is to be a priest in a society, given that people might sometimes be rather alarmed at the power of these agencies and want to have some way of contacting them. So if somebody claimed to have the telephone in that society, that person might have been very influential. And of course, through the evolution of history, temporal powers would have seen the great utility of religious belief as a way of influencing, perhaps even controlling social behavior, because if there is a ubiquitous, invisible policeman, or even more usefully a set of them, then of course it does help a little bit in enjoining a way of behaving and living on people. But if you look back at this reconstructed history of the origin of religious beliefs, or putative origin of beliefs, you notice something. You notice that in the mythologies that we're very familiar with, like for example Greek mythology, that these agencies were actually present in nature. The nymphs and the dryads were right there in the streams and trees, and you could sort of feel their presence. It would be very numinous. You go into an oak grove on your own on a breezy day and listen to the whispering in the crowns of the trees. You feel that there might be beings there you can't see. So it's very, very natural to use this sense of there being other conscious presences as a kind of food, really, for these superstitions or beliefs. So these agencies were right there in nature. But the more our ancestors came to know about nature, the further away these agencies went. In the first instance, they went to mountaintops. So the Olympians, Zeus and the others, were on top of Mount Olympus. Moses met his God on top of a mountain where he got the Ten Commandments, the burning bush. Although some scholars have said that since there was a burning bush on a mountaintop and a pillar of smoke by day, perhaps the early god of the early Jewish peoples was a volcano god, perhaps. But at any rate, on mountaintops. But then when people ventured to mountaintops and didn't find too many gods up there, where did the gods go? Well, into the sky. And where are they now? Well, where's the one remaining one? Well, beyond space and time altogether. So you see a kind of geography of recession in the face of increasing knowledge by humankind about the world. So the deities have reduced in number and have gone much, much further away. And of course, it became a difficulty when there was a realization from accepting finally that the Earth is round and that no one way is up, then you really do have to put your deity beyond space and time, because a physical location for the deity is no longer possible. And all those paintings which show the feet of Jesus as he is ascending into heaven at the top of the canvas become speaking of a very much earlier way of thinking about the universe. So that kind of consideration, the idea that religious beliefs and their role in societies have an origin and a function, and that they evolve, and that the way religions change over time tells us that something about their nature and constitute part of what we would use to prove the validity, to test the validity of religious sentiments and religious claims, becomes very relevant. All the more so when you think of much more recent history than what I've just been talking about the putative origins of religion in those views, those sort of proto-scientific views about the world. But in the classical period, look for example at Roman religious practices, you notice that apart from the mystery religions like Orphism, religion in classical societies tended to be social and political in their function. The great religious festivals of the Roman world existed in order to provide for social cohesion, bonding of this very, very disparate, very large empire. If you think of the extent of the Roman Empire in terms of how long it took to travel across it, many, many different peoples and languages and outlooks and great diversity of cultural backgrounds. And so emperor worship and worship of the gods of the empire was a very, very public thing, and it was about bringing the society together. This is why the Romans thought that the Christians who would not accept the Roman deities were atheists, because they wouldn't sign up for this public participation in these festivals of citizenship and social bonds. And when you think about how personal the relationship is between a devotee and the deity in Christianity, and how ubiquitously present in the lives of observant Muslims the deity is in Islam, you see that there has been a great shift in this more recent history of religion from thinking of religion as something public, as something which has a social and political role, to something which has a much more personal role. And then you think about the way that these young religions have themselves evolved over time. Just think of Christianity. You will remember from your studies of this matter that in the palmy year 313 of the Common Era, the Emperor Constantine and his colleague in imperial office issued an edict at Milan, the Edict of Milan, which said that Christianity was decriminalized. It was going to be okay, which is one of the religions of the Roman Empire. By the year 380 of the Common Era, not very long afterwards in other words, the Edict of Thessalonica said that it was to be the only religion of the Roman Empire. So it was pretty quick work, but it happened not by conquest and coercion, but by assimilation. Now that the religion was accepted and indeed had official imprimatur, it was able to develop very quickly. The priests of the religion were able to say to people things like this: at the great shrine of Diana at Rizzia in Italy, we can now tell you that Diana's real name is Mary. In fact, a lot of the saints of the Roman calendar are local Roman deities who've been habilitated into Christianity to make the acceptance of the religion much easier. And in a very, very short space of time, less than a century, Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Other religions have been banned, regarded as heretical. And since they were the religions mainly of country people, they were denominated as paganism, which actually means rural religion. But at that time, and we're talking about the 4th century of the Common Era, so nearly 400 years after the events which are said to give rise to Christianity, when an orthodox outlook was required and the great councils of the church were held to get rid of heresies like Arianism and sort of alternative views of the Christian message in order to get it down to just one, a great deal of thinking had to be done about the metaphysics and the ethics of Christianity. Because, and this is something which sometimes surprises people who haven't really paid attention to the early evolution of Christian thinking, but if you were to go to the New Testament, that is the 4 Gospels and the epistles of Paul and the Acts, and you were to ask yourself the question, what do these documents tell me about how I should live? What should I do in order to live in conformity with the message of these scriptures? What would the answer be? Remembering, of course, that the very earliest of the Christian writings are the letters of St. Paul, who is, of course, really the founder of the religion, certainly its first theoretician. What would the answer be? Well, the answer would be this. It would say certain things that are common to all ethical systems, whether they're religious or not. Treat your fellow man to your fellow human being as your brother or sister. Be kind to widows and orphans. All the great ethical outlooks say this. 200 years before Jesus lived, there was Mozi in China, the Maoist tradition, and he urged his followers to treat all other humans as their brothers. 500 years before the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, who, by the way, begged his disciples not to make him a god, not to turn his teaching into a religion, because, of course, Theravada Buddhism is a philosophy, not a religion. But he had compassion not just for other people, but for all living things, animals and the natural world as well, so a much more generous attitude even than in Christianity. So in those respects, the ethical teachings are a good commonplace of ethical outlooks. But what's distinctive about Christianity is that it says the following. It says, give away everything that you own, all your money and possessions. Make no plans, take no thought for tomorrow. Consider the lilies of the field, they neither spin nor weave. If your family disagree with you, and by the way they will if you give away all your money and possessions, you've got to turn your back on them. And you are not to marry unless you're about to burst into flame, says St. Paul. Because of course, if you're not going to make any plans, you're certainly not going to have a family. Now, why is that the prescription as to how to live? Because the early Christians very sincerely believed that they lived at the end of time, that the kingdom of heaven was just about to be upon them, that the Messiah was going to return tomorrow, next week, next month. I don't know when, but it's very, very soon. And like the wise virgins, you must keep the wicks of your lamps trimmed, because the end of history is imminent. So you don't need money, you're not going to make plans, you certainly are not going to have a family. If anybody gets in your way, and it might be your own family, you've got to, for the sake of your own eternal fortune of your soul, you have to turn your back on it. Now, 400 years on, when people were looking at their sundials, and this hadn't happened yet, and they began to realize that this way of living was a little bit awkward. No money, no plans, no family, etc. And don't forget that tens of thousands of people actually tried to do it. The eremites, the desert fathers, the people who gave up everything and went to live as hermits, even on top of pillars, get away from everybody else and have no temptations. Some people actually cut off useful bits of themselves in order not to have the temptations that presented themselves. People really seriously tried to live this teaching, and it was impossible. And so when 4 centuries on, the church began to expand, it got many more followers, they had to because it was the only official religion, they needed some more ethics, a different way of thinking about what constituted a good and worthwhile Christian life. And where did they get them from? From Greek philosophy. Most of what people think of as the Christian attitude to life actually comes to us from Aristotle and the post-Aristotelian schools, mainly from Stoicism. If you think of the idea, you remember that concept of the Christian gentleman, the person who's always kind, who never lets on that his right hand is doing a charity and his left hand doesn't know about it, and so on. This is an idea that comes directly from the Aristotelian megalopsychos. Sounds absolutely appalling in ancient Greek. In Latin, it is magna anima, great soul, from which we get our idea of magnanimity. And magnanimity, of course, is a key virtue of the Christian outlook, but it is Aristotelian. It's like the metaphysics that Christianity found that it needed. You go back to St. Paul, you see what he says about death. Now, St. Paul was a Jew, and he held the Jewish view about the nature of death. When you die, you sleep, your body is buried in the ground. When the Messiah comes, the graves open, we all come out of our graves. St. Paul says with new bodies, this is the bit of St. Paul I like because I want a six-pack and a tan. And he says that the saints, that is those who were witnesses and martyrs, will see no corruption. That is, they won't rot in the grave. But that when the graves open, they won't need a new body because they won't have rotted. But when in the 4th century, in the 5th century, many churches were being built, and the bodies of saints and martyrs were needed as relics in the churches for purposes of miracles, they were indeed found to have rotted in the graves. And so this embarrassing discovery, since it meant that either they weren't genuinely holy or there was some other explanation needed, prompted the church to adopt, through Neoplatonism, through the writings and ideas of Plotinus and others, the concept of the immortal soul, which, as you know, was Plato's way of explaining to us how it is that we can only have knowledge of the forms in the realm of being, that we can't have it here in the realm of becoming, so we must have an immortal soul, a pre-existed birth, that when we are born we just forget everything. Education is not being taught anything new, it's just being reminded of what you already know. That doctrine of the immortal soul in Plato, nearly 1,000 years later, found its way into Christianity as an excuse for rotten bodies. And this is an example of the evolution of ideas and thinking in the church, which has of course continued. You've seen that just a few years ago the Catholic Church has abolished limbo. Back in the 90s, the Church of England abolished hell. This is good news for atheists if they happen to be on the one. So you can see how the evolution in these ideas are always fitting the times. St. Paul said that women must sit at the back of the church, cover their heads and keep their mouths shut. And now we're to have women bishops in the church. So, you know, progress very slowly manages to get in, even into those spheres of our social lives. But I mention it because of the fact that religions continually adapt and reinvent themselves in order to match the times that they're in. And that this process is a really recent one in human history. This then, thinking about the way religions originated, how they've evolved, where they get their doctrines from and why they got them, is a way of testing or proving the claims that religion makes. And it is, of course, a problem for us, and we were discussing this over a glass of how adoption of very moderate forms of religions in our world today, you know, the C of E Christians, the Christmas and Easter Christians, who only really believe that there is a sort of a bit of a God, a nice one, on Sundays, and they forget everything else during the course of Monday to Saturday. You know, the cherry pickers, the ones who say, well, the inconvenient bits of the Bible, like stoning to death people who don't go to the synagogue on Saturdays, or who are gay. This is Leviticus I'm quoting to you now. That they forget all those little bits and pick the bits that they can live with, not the bits that they like particularly, because there might be bits that they like, but they're not really prepared to live like that. Give 10% of their earnings, for example, to the church. But that is what moderate religion means. It means cherry-picked religion. It means a lot of self-deception. It means a lot of hypocrisy. And the only people who are really serious about their religious commitments are the people we call fundamentalists or extremists. And that is because they take literally the documents of their religion. So another way of testing or proving, or putting under the microscope whether the claims of religion stand up to scrutiny is to look at the history, to look at the way doctrines develop, to look at what the doctrines actually are, and to look what the votaries of that religion do with those documents, and how many of them they actually believe and apply and accept in their lives. So there are the two ways that you can bring in the concept of proof. Proving the claims that religion makes in the metaphysics, and proving the actual practice and commitments of those who have that commitment to see whether it matches up to what they claim to be the case about the work. And I would have thought that having done this fairly exhaustively, as you've examined it all the way through, that what would be left, the residuum that would be left, is the emotional commitment, and in the case of some people who are very sincere in their religious outlook, it's a very deep emotional commitment, a way of answering a need felt acutely, as it might be, for some connection with the whole of the universe, or some sense of security in it, or some way of overcoming the fear of existential loneliness that we sometimes feel, a way of satisfying that thing that we all have as reflective and thoughtful human beings, and that is a kind of yearning for the absolute, a desire really to be connected with others and with the universe around us. And what the religions have been quite successful at doing is hijacking those feelings and claiming to have an answer to them or a response to them. Claiming that the spiritual aspect of our lives, and if I'm allowed to use the word spiritual for a moment to mean nothing spooky, nothing transcendental, but just the complex of our emotional and intellectual responses and attitudes, the way we as a whole person respond to our world and to others. If I could use that to denote the spiritual in us in a kind of materialist, non-spooky way, then that is the part of us which is the most important part of us, the most important part of our lives, because it's the part of us which most deeply feels the love that we give and receive, and our friendships and our connections with others, and where the things that we most treasure in our lives reside, our hopes, our aspirations, our desire to make some contribution or to achieve something in life. That whole locus, that very, very private, very deep thing about us. Now, in the case of some people who are, for one reason or another, and mainly, of course, because of their upbringings, and it's a point I'll come back to, feel that that aspect of themselves can only be made sense of if there is a deity, or if there's a great purpose that such a being is set for us in our lives, or that there is some terminus to these endeavors which lies on the other side of life in an afterlife, that are saying. But with the kind of courage and clarity that one might have in thinking about one's own existence and one's own responsibility for the choices that one makes, one can see that part of ourselves as being rich, deep, normal, very important, but our own. And that is something that, if we were discussing a humanistic outlook on the world, we would recognize as being really central to that way of thinking. It doesn't belong to, it doesn't have to be explained only in terms of some kind of religious belief, but really is something which is just true of human beings at their best. Human beings, of course, are also capable of very nasty stuff, as we know, alas, and we are all of us an alloy. We're all of us capable of being bitchy at times and unpleasant to people and selfish and greedy, but we're also capable of being our best selves at times too. And it's that bit of us that the humanist outlook wants us to try to foster and encourage. And it's that bit which the religions have hijacked and said that's got something to do with the fact that you were created by a deity and a deity has a purpose for you. Now, very occasionally I get into a conversation with cab drivers in black cabs in London who ask me what I do. And I tell them I teach philosophy. You notice the choice of words. I didn't say I am a philosopher, because to say that is to put yourself in Manchester United first team along with Plato and Aristotle. I don't say that. I say I teach philosophy. So there's a silence for a moment, because the cab driver has thought that you said that you are one, and he's thinking to himself, what the heck does a philosopher do when he gets up in the morning? So a plumber does, and a doctor and so on, but does a philosopher what he do? So the answer is yes, of course. So then they say, so, Governor, what's the meaning of life? Almost inevitable question. Although I did once have a discussion with the cab driver. I asked him, as one does, you know, had he read the Old Testament lately? He said he had never read it. And I asked him if he remembered anything from, heard anything about the Old Testament. After a moment, he said, yes, I remember something about a woman being turned into a pillar of salt. I took this as evidence of the fact that he just had a bit of a domestic earlier in the day. This was wishful thinking, you know. I said, do you know where that story comes from? No, he said. I said, it's the story of Lot, who was a citizen of Sodom, where things went on that God didn't like. So God decided that he was going to massacre everybody, wipe out the city and all the people who lived there, which is the Old Testament God. He had a bit of habit that he had. But then he was reminded that there might be somebody in the city who was righteous. And indeed there was, and this was Lot. And so he sent 2 angels down. Now angels are rather good-looking, sort of hot, rather buff, you know, young men-looking like beings. And the citizens of Sodom wanted them as a result. And they chased after them all through the streets of the city. And they managed to get into Lot's house, and the citizens of Sodom beat on the door and said, give us those 2 young men. And Lot said, no, you can have my daughters. I've got 2 daughters here. You can do what you like to them, he says. He really does. And the citizens of Sodom said, daughters? Give us those 2 young men. So anyway, Lot and his daughters and his wife managed to escape. Of course, when the city was nuked, Lot's wife did turn around and look. She was turned to a pillar of salt. And that meant that Lot was left with his 2 daughters at the top of the mountain. The daughters were very dissatisfied because they had no husbands and therefore couldn't have children. So they laid a plot. They made their father drunk, and they slept with him one night and the other the next night. And they were the ancestresses, as a result, of the Moabites and the Amalekites, I think. But anyway, the ancestresses of 2 of the tribes. So here's a story of Sodom, mass murder, murder of a woman for looking over her shoulder, incest. Okay, this is Book of Genesis. The cab driver said to me, is that in the Bible? He said, in outraged tones. I said, yes. He said, surely they cut it out. Very good example. He is an outstanding example of the sheer ignorance that there is about the fundamentals, the bases on which people hold the views they do and live the lives that they do and perform the actions that they do, thinking that they believe something which perhaps actually they don't, if they were to look into it. And that would be a really crucial part of the test of religious claims, is getting people to give you an account of what it is they accept and don't accept, and what they believe and why they believe it, and whether the beliefs that they hold now are in any way conformable to the beliefs that originate the tradition that they take themselves to belong to. And this is a really important thing, because it would be part of the re-education of our world if people were much more alert to and knowledgeable about the things that they think they believe. I once had the experience of being asked by the BBC to go with Bishop Richard Harries, who used to be Bishop of Oxford, to go to a Church of England school, an all-girls school in South London, to see what a church school was really like. And I think the challenge that Richard Harris was making to me was that I was going to see that it was a decent place and that religion was sort of moderate and didn't really harm the girls there. And the headmistress of the school said to us when we arrived, she said, well, we've got, mainly the Church of England, we've got some Catholics, we've got some Muslim girls, there's even an atheist in the sixth form, token atheist, and we encourage them to be very respectful and tolerant towards one another. And she said it as though we were going to praise her for it. I said, well, that's the least we would expect of you, so you don't get any brownie points for that, but what you would get brownie points for from me is whether you challenge these girls to think all the way through to the end of what they believe themselves to believe, or what the religions are asking of them. She said, what do you mean? I said, I'll show you. Suffer the children to come unto me, and I will give you an example of a little Socratic dialogue. And so we had the Catholic girl, Church of England girl, a Muslim girl, and the atheist girl. They came. And I said to the Catholic girl, your church teaches that there is no salvation outside the church. That unless you accept the salvific act of sacrifice performed by Jesus Christ, the atonement, bringing back into oneness God and man, that there is no salvation. Now, your Muslim friend here doesn't believe that Jesus is divine, the Son of God. So what is going to happen to her when she dies? And the Catholic girl said, well, I wouldn't like to say. I said, go on, what does your church teach about people who won't accept the saving grace of Christ's sacrifice? Well, she's going to go to hell. So I said to the Muslim girl, now your friend here hasn't accepted that Muhammad is the prophet of God. And indeed, it may be, given that Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and a load of saints and everything else, that there's only one God and so on. So what's going to happen to her when she dies? Well, I'm afraid she's going to go to hell. I should just mention, by the way, that these were all friends, these girls. They all did their homework together and walked to school together and so on. So then I said, what about the atheist girl? And finally there was consensus. Well, she's going to go to hell. The headmistress said, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're sowing discord and strife and disagreement. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm just getting them to think all the way through to some of the consequences of what they think they believe, because they don't really believe this. They don't really believe that their friends are going to go to hell. And they've got to confront, they've got to be challenged with these things. Otherwise, they're going to go on just living behind a Chinese wall. They can be rational in every other aspect of their lives. And this deep irrationality or non-rationality of belief and practice will persist. And you can see that at the extreme, it can have very bad consequences for them and for our society as a whole. And so this business of proving or testing, of challenging, of asking people to think about things all the way through is really key. Not least for this reason, and this is my final remark, that the vast majority of people belong to the religion of their parents. And when you reflect on that fact, you begin to understand part of the problem. That religious beliefs are inculcated into small children who are intellectually defenseless at the time. They believe in Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy and God because they are evolved to be credulous about everything that the adults in their circle tell them. By the age of 10 or 11, the Tooth Fairy and Father Christmas have gone, but there is massive social reinforcement. There are church spires, and mosques and synagogues, and men in dresses on television at great state occasions and so on. There's massive reinforcement. Religion and religious studies in schools are pervasive. I mean, you all remember this, how you had to do your RSGCSE, and those of you who took what's called philosophy and ethics, philosophy of religion and ethics at school, and it's pervasive. So it forms part of the wallpaper of people's lives in a way that makes it very difficult for them to break away from it. Partly because so many people think it doesn't matter, but we know that it does. But partly also because they are invited to think about everything, to be careful about their bank balance and their overdraft, and carefully choose who they're going to marry and what they're going to do with their income or what job they're going to apply for, but never to think carefully about these ancient superstitions which permeate our lives like a gas. Thank you very much.